By the time the Emergency Ethics Committee session ended at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas would sit in documented silence for 23 seconds while a first-term Congresswoman from Texas held up a folder he believed no longer existed. One question would hang in the air of that hearing room, unanswered, devastating, permanent. But to understand how Jasmine Crockett brought the most protected jurist in America to complete collapse, you have to understand what happened 4 hours earlier when she first entered that room. The Emergency Ethics Committee had been convened with 48 hours' notice. The subject was corruption at the highest levels of the federal judiciary. Clarence Thomas was not technically required to attend. He chose to. The choice would define his legacy. Thomas entered the hearing chamber at 7:14 p.m. with the bearing of a man who had survived 40 years of political warfare and emerged untouched. He wore the same expression he had worn through 3 decades of confirmation battles, scandal coverage, and investigative exposures. It was the face of a man who understood that survival in Washington required one thing above all others: never admitting error, never showing doubt, never giving ground. He had built a judicial philosophy on originalism and a political identity on grievance. Both had served him well. He settled into his chair with the confidence of someone who knew the game better than anyone in the room. Jasmine Crockett was already seated 3 chairs down. If Thomas registered her presence, he gave no indication. She was a freshman representative from Dallas, an attorney who had won her seat 8 months earlier running on criminal justice reform and government accountability. To a man like Clarence Thomas, with 32 years on the Supreme Court and a lifetime appointment that made him functionally unaccountable to anyone, she represented exactly nothing. A footnote to a hearing that would produce no consequences because no consequences ever had. When the chairman asked Thomas if he would prefer to testify first or hear the allegations, Thomas leaned forward into the microphone with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who believed every word he was about to say. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to address these baseless and politically motivated attacks on my integrity. I have spent 3 decades on the nation's highest court serving the Constitution and the American people with honor. My record speaks for itself. My financial disclosures have been timely and complete. My relationships are personal, long-standing, and entirely appropriate. I have broken no laws. I have violated no ethics codes. And I will not be intimidated by partisan operatives who seek to undermine the independence of the federal judiciary through coordinated smear campaigns. The words landed exactly as he intended them to land. Several members of the committee nodded. The opening statement had established the terms. This was political theater, he was the victim, and nothing said tonight would change the fundamental equation of power. Thomas had been using this formula since 1991. It had never failed him. These so-called revelations, he continued, warming to the theme, are nothing more than recycled gossip and innuendo dressed up as investigative journalism. ProPublica and similar outlets have built entire business models on generating outrage about conservative justices while ignoring identical behavior from their ideological allies. I have known Harlan Crow for 25 years. He is a friend, a generous friend, yes, a Republican donor, yes, but a friend first and foremost. The idea that our personal relationship somehow compromises my judicial independence is absurd on its face and insulting to both of us. The performance was masterful. Frame the accusers as partisan. Frame the evidence as old news. Frame the relationship as personal friendship rather than financial entanglement. And most importantly, frame any suggestion of wrongdoing as an attack on the entire institution of the Supreme Court. It was not just his integrity being questioned. It was the integrity of the court itself. Any member of this committee who pursued these allegations was by definition attacking the court. And attacking the court was attacking the Constitution. The logical chain was airtight, or at least it had been for 3 decades. Thomas spoke for 17 minutes without interruption. He mentioned his modest upbringing in Pinpoint, Georgia. He mentioned his years of public service. He mentioned the relentless attacks he had endured from the left since his confirmation hearings. He mentioned his financial struggles early in his career, the student loans, the sacrifices his family had made. He painted a picture of a man who had devoted his life to public service and was now being punished for accepting the generosity of old friends during moments when his government salary proved insufficient to cover family medical expenses, educational costs, and basic human dignity. By the time he finished, 2 committee members were visibly sympathetic. The chairman thanked him for his candor. Thomas leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who had just delivered a closing argument he knew was unbeatable. Jasmine Crockett had not moved during the entire 17 minutes. She had not taken notes. She had not whispered to staff. She had simply watched him with the expression of a trial attorney listening to an opening statement she knew was about to be systematically destroyed by the evidence. When the chairman turned to her and asked if she had questions for Justice Thomas, she adjusted the microphone in front of her and spoke in a voice that carried none of the theatrical outrage that typically characterized these hearings. It was clinical, precise, almost gentle. Justice Thomas, thank you for being here tonight. I know this is not a comfortable setting for any of us. Before I begin, I want to establish a baseline of facts that I believe we can all agree on. You stated that your financial disclosures have been timely and complete. Is that correct? Thomas barely hesitated. That is correct. And you stated that your relationship with Harlan Crow is personal, long-standing, and entirely appropriate. Is that also correct? It is. And you believe you have broken no laws and violated no ethics codes. Correct? Absolutely correct. Crockett nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. Then she reached beneath the table in front of her and lifted a dark blue binder onto the surface. It was perhaps 3 inches thick. The tabs were color-coded and visible from across the room. She did not open it yet. She simply placed it on the table with the gentleness of someone setting down a loaded weapon. I appreciate your clarity, Justice Thomas. It makes what comes next much simpler. Something in the room shifted. It was not dramatic. Thomas did not sit forward. The committee members did not gasp. But the energy changed in the way it changes in a courtroom when a prosecutor opens a folder and the defendant realizes for the first time that the case is not what they thought it was. Crockett opened the binder to the first tab section. The tab read, Bohemian Grove 2019. She removed a single sheet and placed it on the table, angling it so the cameras could capture it. This is an invoice, she said, from the Bohemian Grove Club dated July 2019. It documents expenses for a private gathering attended by yourself, Harlan Crow, several Crow family members, and a number of Republican donors and conservative activists. The total cost of your portion of the stay, as documented here, was $11,400. This amount was paid in full by Harlan Crow. It does not appear on any of your financial disclosure forms from 2019, 2020, or 2021. Am I reading this correctly? Thomas's expression did not change, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. He was no longer leaning back. I don't recall that specific invoice. I understand. Let me help refresh your memory. She turned to the next tab. Croatian yacht trip, August 2021. 9 days aboard a super yacht owned by Harlan Crow. Total estimated value of the trip, based on standard charter rates for vessels of this class, is $480,000. This trip included air travel, meals, excursions, and use of the yacht's crew and amenities. None of this appears on your financial disclosures. Would you like to see the yacht's manifest with your name on it? Thomas's jaw tightened. Personal hospitality between friends has never been required to be disclosed under the relevant statutes as they were interpreted at that time. I appreciate that distinction, Justice Thomas. We will return to it. But first, let's continue establishing the pattern. The word pattern landed like a gavel strike. Thomas's eyes moved to the binder. There were at least 15 more tabs. Crockett turned to tab 3. Adirondacks Compound, summer of 2017. Private plane transport from Washington to upstate New York, provided by Mr. Crow. 1 week at a private estate, 4 additional couples in attendance, all major Republican donors. Your wife accompanied you. Total estimated value, $67,000, not disclosed. Tab 4, Napa Valley 2018, private wine auction and retreat, transport via Mr. Crow's Gulfstream. Accommodations at a private residence. Rare wine purchases made on your behalf totaling $18,000, not disclosed. Tab 5, Super Bowl 2020, luxury suite, Pre-game events, after parties, estimated value $41,000, not disclosed. Tab 6. Tuition payments for your grandnephew at private boarding schools, $213,000 over 4 years, paid directly by Harlan Crow to Randolph-Macon Academy and Hidden Lake Academy. You stated in interviews that you were paying for his education as an act of charity after taking him in. In fact, Harlan Crow paid for it, not disclosed. The room had gone completely silent. Not the performative silence of dramatic television, but the real silence that occurs when everyone present understands they are watching something unprecedented unfold. 2 members of the committee were now taking rapid notes. One had pulled up the ProPublica reports on a tablet, scrolling frantically. Thomas's hands had moved from relaxed on the table to gripped together, knuckles whitening. His voice, when he spoke again, had lost some of its earlier certainty. These were personal gifts between friends. The disclosure requirements have always been ambiguous regarding personal hospitality. I relied on guidance and precedent. Crockett did not raise her voice. She simply turned to tab 7. Let's talk about the guidance you relied on, Justice Thomas. This is a memo from the Judicial Conference dated 2003, updated 2009, and again 2016. It explicitly states that gifts of transportation on private planes must be disclosed at market charter rates. It provides examples, it includes yacht travel, it specifies that tuition payments for family members must be disclosed if they exceed certain thresholds, which every payment from Mr. Crow did. You have had access to this guidance for 19 years. The claim of ambiguity is documented as false. She placed the memo on the table. The official seal of the Judicial Conference was clearly visible. Thomas said nothing. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The only sound in the room was the click of a photographer's camera shutter from the press gallery. Justice Thomas, Crockett continued, her voice still calm, still measured, I want to be very clear about what we are establishing here. This is not a pattern of personal hospitality between friends. This is a pattern of undisclosed gifts from a single benefactor totaling, by our conservative estimates based on market rates, approximately $3.2 million over a 15-year period. These gifts went to a sitting Supreme Court justice who has ruled on cases involving campaign finance law, dark money in politics, and government ethics requirements. A Supreme Court justice who has consistently voted to expand the rights of wealthy donors and corporations to influence political outcomes. A Supreme Court justice who has argued that disclosure requirements burden free speech and should be struck down. The words hung in the air, devastating precisely because they were delivered without anger, without partisan rhetoric, without anything that could be dismissed as political theater. They were simply facts, documented, cross-referenced, impossible to deny. But we're not done yet. Crockett turned to tab 8. This one was thicker than the others. She removed not a single page, but a stack of perhaps 20 pages bound together with a binder clip. When she placed it on the table, the thud was audible. This is the purchase agreement for your mother's home in Savannah, Georgia. In 2014, Harlan Crow purchased the property for $133,000. According to public records, he also purchased the 2 adjacent vacant lots. Total transaction value, $175,000. Your mother, Leola Williams, continued to live in the property rent-free until her death in 2024. You described this home as family property in interviews. You did not disclose the sale. You did not disclose the arrangement. And when ProPublica asked you about it last year, you declined to comment. Thomas's face had taken on a grayish tint under the harsh committee room lighting. Sweat was beginning to defeat his carefully applied makeup. He reached for a glass of water with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. That was a legitimate real estate transaction. Was it? Let's examine that claim. According to the Chatham County Assessor's Office, the property was valued at $189,000 at the time of sale. Mr. Crow paid $133,000. That is a 30% below market sale. More importantly, the property was sold by you, a sitting Supreme Court justice, to your personal benefactor, who then allowed your mother to continue living there rent-free, which is functionally equivalent to Mr. Crow paying your mother's housing costs for 10 years. The fair market rental value of that property over 10 years is approximately $168,000. None of this was disclosed, and all of it represents a financial benefit flowing from Harlan Crow to your family during a period when you were ruling on cases that directly affected his political interests. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. The silence stretched. 15 seconds. 20. 23. The press gallery had stopped typing. Every phone was recording. This was the moment that would be clipped, shared, replayed 10 million times. A Supreme Court justice, confronted with his own documented corruption, unable to speak. Finally, Thomas forced out words. "I have done nothing illegal." Crockett nodded. "You keep saying that, Justice Thomas, and you may be technically correct. The criminal statutes governing judicial bribery are written narrowly. The disclosure laws have loopholes. The Supreme Court has exempted itself from the code of conduct that applies to every other federal judge in America. You have operated within a system that was designed by people like you to protect people like you. But that does not make what you did legal. It makes the law insufficient." She turned to tab 9. "Let me show you something else." This tab contained photographs. Crockett lifted the first one. It showed Justice Thomas on a yacht, smiling, holding a drink, standing next to Harlan Crow and David Koch. The image was dated August 2021, the same Croatian trip from earlier testimony. This photograph was taken the same week the Supreme Court heard arguments in Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, a case that struck down California's donor disclosure requirements for nonprofits. You were in the majority. The decision was 5-4. Your vote was decisive. Harlan Crow has donated tens of millions of dollars to nonprofits that work to influence judicial appointments and political outcomes. David Koch, pictured here with you, ran one of the largest dark money networks in American history before his death, and you were vacationing with them at their expense while deciding whether donor disclosure laws were constitutional. She placed another photograph on the table. Same yacht, different day. Thomas in the background, Crow, and several other men in the foreground examining documents. This is not friendship, Justice Thomas. This is a financial relationship between a sitting Supreme Court justice and the political donor class. And the decisions you have rendered from the bench reflect that relationship with perfect consistency. For the first time, Thomas's composure began to crack visibly. His voice rose. "You are making an accusation of corruption based on circumstantial evidence and political bias. I have ruled on cases according to my judicial philosophy, which has been consistent for 3 decades." "Your judicial philosophy," Crockett said, her voice not rising to match his, "includes the idea that money is speech and corporations are people. Your judicial philosophy has consistently expanded the power of wealthy donors and reduced accountability for government officials. Your judicial philosophy happens to perfectly align with the financial interests of the man who has given your family $3.2 million in undisclosed gifts. I am not suggesting that is a coincidence. I am suggesting it is a pattern." Thomas's hands were shaking now. "This is a partisan attack designed to undermine the legitimacy of the court." "No, Justice Thomas, this is documentation. Would you like to see the rest?" She gestured to the binder. 10 tabs remained. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. Thomas was not thinking of an answer. He was calculating whether he could survive the rest of what was in that binder becoming public. The calculation was visible on his face. "Let me tell you what else is in here," Crockett said. "Tab 10 is correspondence between you and Mr. Crow regarding political strategy during the 2016 election. Tab 11 is travel records showing 7 additional trips that have never been disclosed. Tab 12 is a list of every case you have heard involving Crow family business interests, cross-referenced with your votes. Tab 13 is testimony from former judicial clerks who were present during conversations about these gifts and were told not to discuss them. Tab 14 is the original, unedited footage from interviews you gave claiming you had no wealthy benefactors and lived modestly. Tab 15 is your net worth trajectory over the past 20 years compared to your disclosed income, showing a mathematical impossibility unless substantial unreported income was received." She paused, letting him absorb it. I have receipts for all of it, Justice Thomas. Emails, bank records, testimony under oath, photographs, flight manifests, property records. Everything you said could not be proven, I have proven. Everything you said did not exist, exists. You came into this room believing that your reputation and your position would protect you, but you forgot something fundamental. You forgot that evidence is not political, documents do not have partisan affiliations, and the truth does not care about your judicial philosophy. Thomas's mouth opened. No sound came out. His eyes moved from the binder to Crockett's face to the cameras to the chairman. He was looking for an exit. There was none. Then, without warning, the rear door of the hearing room opened. A woman entered. She was in her 60s, black, wearing a navy pantsuit and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime being ignored by people in power. She walked to the witness table and sat down in the chair next to Crockett. The chairman looked confused. Crockett stood. Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce Mrs. Dorothy Means. She is a retired public school teacher from Baltimore. She worked for 34 years in the Maryland public school system. She is here tonight because her story illustrates what happens when the people at the top of our government stop believing that rules apply to them. Dorothy Means adjusted the microphone. Her hands were not shaking. Her voice was steady and clear. I do not know Justice Thomas personally. I have never met him. I have no opinion on his judicial philosophy or his politics. I am here because of my pension. She paused, gathering the courage to continue. In 2018, I retired from teaching with a pension that had been promised to me as part of my compensation for 3 decades of public service. In 2020, a lawsuit was filed challenging the funding mechanism for public pensions in Maryland on constitutional grounds. The case was Maryland Public Employees Union versus Hogan. It reached the Supreme Court in 2022. Justice Thomas wrote the majority opinion. The opinion ruled that the pension funding violated some constitutional principle I still do not fully understand. The result was that my pension was cut by 42%. I now make less than $28,000 a year to live on. I cannot afford my medications. I had to move from my house to an apartment. I worked for 34 years believing that my government would keep its promise to me. Justice Thomas decided that promise was unconstitutional. Her voice did not break. It simply carried the weight of someone describing an injustice she could not change. I later learned that the case was funded by a think tank called the State Policy Network. I learned that this think tank receives funding from Harlan Crow and the Koch network. I learned that the lawyers who argued the case had previously worked for organizations funded by Justice Thomas's benefactors. I learned that Justice Thomas did not recuse himself despite these connections. And I learned that I am one of 17,000 retired teachers in Maryland whose pensions were cut as a result of that decision. The room was completely still. Dorothy Means looked directly at Clarence Thomas. I do not know if what you did was legal or illegal, Justice Thomas, but I know that you took money from the same people who funded the lawsuit that destroyed my retirement, and I know that you ruled in their favor, and I know that men like you never face consequences while women like me lose everything. I am here tonight to tell you that your decisions have names and faces. We are not abstractions. We are real people, and we deserved better from you. She stood and walked out of the hearing room. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. When Crockett finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost exhausted. Justice Thomas, Mrs. Means is one of thousands of Americans whose lives have been materially harmed by your decisions. Decisions you made while accepting millions of dollars in gifts from the people who funded the litigation. You keep saying you broke no laws, but you broke something more important than laws. You broke the public trust. You broke the promise that Supreme Court justices would be above corruption. And you broke the lives of people like Dorothy Means who believed that their government would protect them instead of selling them out to billionaires. Thomas's face had gone from gray to red. His hands gripped the edge of the table. When he spoke, his voice was no longer calm. It was angry, defensive, desperate. This is a show trial. You have orchestrated this entire hearing to humiliate me on camera. You have brought in a sympathetic witness to manipulate emotions. You have taken legitimate personal friendships and twisted them into a conspiracy theory designed to delegitimize the court. I will not sit here and be attacked like this. He pushed his chair back and stood. Crockett's voice cut through the room, still calm, still measured, but carrying an edge now that had not been there before. Sit down, Justice Thomas. He froze. You are not on the Supreme Court bench right now. You are a witness before a congressional committee. You agreed to testify. You will answer the questions. The chairman, startled by the confrontation, intervened. Justice Thomas, please. Representative Crockett is correct. We need to complete the testimony. Thomas lowered himself back into the chair. The motion was slow, reluctant, humiliated. He had attempted to exercise the power of his office and it had failed. For perhaps the first time in 32 years, he was not the most powerful person in the room. Crockett sat down and opened the binder to the final tab, tab 16. She removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the table. This is a proposed amendment to the Supreme Court Ethics and Disclosure Act currently being drafted by House Judiciary. It closes every loophole you exploited. It requires real-time disclosure of all gifts above $100. It mandates recusal when financial relationships create even the appearance of a conflict of interest. It establishes an independent inspector general for the Supreme Court with subpoena power. And it creates a private right of action for citizens to sue when justices violate these requirements. She looked directly at Thomas. You asked earlier whether this was a partisan attack. It is not. This is accountability. For 30 years, you have operated as if you were above the law because the law was written to allow people like you to operate above it. That era is over. This hearing is not about punishing you, Justice Thomas. It is about ensuring that no one in your position can ever do what you did again. She closed the binder. I have one final question for you. It is very simple. I would like a yes or no answer. The room waited. Justice Thomas, do you believe that accepting $3.2 million in undisclosed gifts from a political donor while ruling on cases affecting that donor's interests creates even the appearance of a conflict of interest? 23 seconds of silence. The cameras recorded every second. The press gallery counted them. The American people watching on C-SPAN and YouTube and every news network carrying the hearing live counted them. 23 seconds during which a Supreme Court Justice of the United States could not bring himself to answer a yes or no question because both answers would destroy him. If he said no, he would confirm that he believed himself above ethical standards that apply to every other public official. If he said yes, he would admit that his decisions were compromised and his legacy was corrupt. There was no third option. Finally, Thomas spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. I have nothing further to say. He stood. This time no one stopped him. He walked to the door, his movement stiff, his posture defeated. The cameras followed him the entire way. When the door closed behind him, the sound echoed through the chamber. Crockett remained seated. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply gathered her documents, placed them back in the binder, and closed it with the same careful precision she had opened it with. When the chairman asked if she had additional witnesses, she shook her head. No, Mr. Chairman, the evidence speaks for itself. The hearing adjourned at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, the 23-second silence had been clipped and shared 800,000 times. By morning, it would be 12 million. Within a week, Justice Thomas would face calls for impeachment from 73 members of Congress. The Supreme Court Ethics and Disclosure Act would pass the House with bipartisan support. And Clarence Thomas, who had spent 3 decades building a reputation as an untouchable force in American jurisprudence, would become the first Supreme Court justice in modern history to face a credible impeachment inquiry based not on ideology, but on documented corruption. Jasmine Crockett had entered that hearing room as a freshman representative with 8 months of experience. She left it as the congresswoman who proved that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice with a lifetime appointment, is above accountability when someone bothers to do the work and bring the receipts. The folder she carried that night contained 347 pages of documentation. Every page was sourced. Every claim was verified. Every number was accurate. She had not relied on rhetoric or outrage. She had simply presented the truth methodically and completely, and let it do what truth does when it is finally allowed into the room. In the days that followed, people would ask her how she felt about what happened, how it felt to take down someone so powerful.